It was supposed to be just another morning at the federal courthouse. Security checks, metal detectors, the usual routine. Until a deputy decided that one woman didn't look like she belonged. They humiliated her. They violated her dignity. They laughed while stripping away her hair strand by strand, thinking she was nobody special. Just another black woman who needed to learn her place in their courthouse. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that they had just assaulted the wrong person, because she wasn't just another citizen walking through their doors. She was the federal judge about to take her seat on the bench, and what followed would be a reckoning unlike anything that courthouse had ever seen. Justice was coming, and it had a name: Nova Patterson. Tell us where you're watching from and what time. Drop it in the comments below. If you believe that justice should apply equally to everyone, regardless of their position or appearance, type equality below. It was just after 8 a.m. when Nova Patterson stepped out of her charcoal gray Honda and walked up the granite steps of the Denver Federal Courthouse. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves from the oak trees lining the courthouse plaza. She adjusted the collar of her burgundy blazer, squared her shoulders, and clutched a slim black leather portfolio in her left hand. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished stone, each step a quiet declaration of purpose. Nova didn't wear her judicial robe outside the courtroom. She never did. She preferred to move through the world like any other citizen, observant, composed, but unremarkable. At 52, she had learned that power was most effective when it remained hidden until the moment it was needed. Her silver-streaked hair was twisted into an elegant updo, secured with a simple tortoiseshell clip. She wore minimal jewelry, just her wedding ring and small gold earrings, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every step she took through these halls. But that morning, as she approached the main security checkpoint, she wasn't seen as a federal judge. She wasn't even seen as someone who belonged there. She was just another black woman walking into a place where authority had never come easily to people who looked like her. Deputy Keith Beaumont was stationed at the primary checkpoint, his thick forearms crossed as he supervised the morning flow of attorneys, clerks, and citizens. At 45, Keith had been working courthouse security for over 12 years, long enough to develop strong opinions about who belonged in federal buildings and who needed to be reminded of their place. When he spotted Nova approaching, something about her posture irritated him immediately. She walked like she owned the place. "Ma'am," Keith called out, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that men like him used when they wanted to establish dominance. "Step to the secondary screening area." Nova paused, her dark eyes meeting his directly. "Is there a specific reason for additional screening?" Keith didn't answer immediately. His gaze swept over her deliberately, taking in everything from her professional attire to the calm but questioning look in her eyes. In his experience, people who asked questions were people who thought they had rights. And people who thought they had rights needed to be educated about reality. "Random security protocol," he said, though there was nothing random about it. "This way." Nova remained still for a moment, her internal alarm system fully activated. She had faced this kind of treatment before, the assumption that her presence in professional spaces required additional justification. But she was expected in courtroom 7A in exactly 28 minutes to preside over a significant corporate discrimination case, and she couldn't afford to be late. "I'll need to see your identification and any credentials," Keith continued, stepping closer. "Federal building security requires thorough vetting of all individuals who appear suspicious." The word suspicious hung in the air like smoke. Nova reached into her blazer and produced her federal judicial identification, the gold badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But Keith barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket. "Follow me," he said, not waiting for her response. He led her away from the main flow of foot traffic, down a side corridor lined with administrative offices, toward a windowless room marked Secondary Screening. The hallway was empty, except for the distant sound of heels on marble and the low hum of ventilation systems. Nova's training as a judge had taught her to assess situations quickly and completely. She noted the lack of witnesses, the isolated location, and the deliberate way Keith positioned himself between her and the exit. But she also knew that resistance without proper documentation would only escalate the situation. I'm expected in a courtroom in 25 minutes, she said firmly as Keith opened the door to the screening room. Then you'd better cooperate, he replied. The room was sterile and cold, containing only a metal chair, a small table with scanning equipment, and a rolling cart with various security implements. Keith motioned for her to sit, but Nova remained standing. I don't consent to any search beyond standard security protocols, she said clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. But Keith had already moved to the cart, where a pair of electric clippers sat alongside other tools. He picked them up, testing the weight in his hands. What's underneath all that hair? He asked, his tone suggesting he'd made this decision before they'd even entered the room. And that's when Nova Patterson realized that her morning was about to become something far worse than an inconvenience. But what Deputy Keith Beaumont didn't realize was that he was about to make the worst mistake of his career. What happened next would change everything. Standard security procedure, Keith said, plugging in the clippers. The mechanical buzz filled the small room like an angry wasp. You could be concealing anything in there, weapons, drugs, contraband. Nova's heart began beating faster, but her voice remained steady. I am a federal employee with proper identification. This is assault and I'm instructing you to stop. Keith moved closer, the clippers humming in his right hand. You can instruct all you want. But I'm the authority in this building, and you're just another person trying to get somewhere you probably don't belong. The racial undertone was unmistakable. Nova had faced discrimination before, subtle and overt. But this was different. This was violence wrapped in the facade of procedure, and she was trapped in a room with a man who clearly felt entitled to degrade her. You will answer for this, she said quietly. But Keith was no longer listening. 2 additional guards entered the room, a younger man with nervous eyes and an older woman who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. They positioned themselves on either side of Nova's chair without being asked, creating a wall of authority that made resistance seem futile. Hold still, Keith commanded, but Nova tried to stand. The younger guard, following Keith's lead, pressed down on her shoulders. Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Nova felt the cold metal of the clippers touch her scalp. The sensation was violating, invasive, like fingers rifling through her most personal possessions. The first section of her carefully styled hair fell to the floor in a silver-streaked clump, landing near her feet like a piece of herself being torn away. Please stop, she said, but her voice was steady, controlled. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Keith continued methodically, section by section, each pass of the clippers removing another piece of the dignity she had spent decades building. Her hair, which she had grown and cared for as a connection to her heritage, her identity, her grandmother's memory, fell around the chair in uneven piles. Much better, Keith muttered as he worked. Now you look more appropriate for where you are. The other guards said nothing, but Nova could feel their discomfort. The woman shifted from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. The younger man's grip on Nova's shoulder loosened slightly, as if he was realizing they had crossed a line. But Nova didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a point just above Keith's head. Because crying would give him power. Breaking would validate his assumptions. And Nova Patterson had not spent 30 years in law to hand her dignity to a man who had done nothing to earn it. When Keith finished, he stepped back to admire his work. Nova's scalp was now covered only in uneven patches of hair, some areas completely bare, others showing angry red marks from the clippers' rough treatment. There we go, Keith said, unplugging the clippers with satisfaction. Now you look like someone who knows her place. He opened the door and gestured toward the hallway. You're free to proceed to wherever you think you're going. Nova stood slowly, her legs steady despite everything that had just happened. She picked up her portfolio, which had been set aside during the assault, and walked toward the door. As she passed Keith, she spoke just loudly enough for all 3 guards to hear. You have no idea what you've just done. Keith laughed. I know exactly what I did. I maintained security in a federal building. That's my job. Nova walked out of the room, down the hallway, and back toward the main courthouse corridors. Her scalp burned where the clippers had been too rough. Her neck felt cold and exposed. But her spine remained straight, her shoulders square, her head held high. Other people in the hallway stared as she passed. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to have witnessed her humiliation. Others whispered among themselves, wondering what kind of criminal had been processed in the security room. But Nova Patterson kept walking because she had a courtroom to reach and a job to do. And in exactly 14 minutes, Keith Beaumont and everyone else in that building would discover who she really was. The clicks of her heels against the marble floor sounded different now, not just confident, but determined. Each step carried her closer to a reckoning that would echo far beyond the walls of the Denver Federal Courthouse. Because sometimes justice doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it walks quietly through hallways, carrying the evidence of its own assault, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its true power. And that moment was coming fast. Nova entered the private judicial chambers adjacent to Courtroom 7A, with exactly 8 minutes to spare. The familiar space, lined with law books, decorated with her diplomas and commendations, felt like a sanctuary after the assault she had just endured. But when she caught sight of herself in the mirror above the small wash basin, the reality of what had happened hit her fully. Her scalp was a patchwork of uneven stubble and bare skin, some areas showing red irritation from the rough handling of the clippers. The elegant updo she had carefully arranged that morning was gone, replaced by the evidence of a hate crime, committed under the guise of security. But Nova Patterson had not survived 3 decades in the legal profession by allowing others to define her worth. She reached for the black judicial robe hanging behind her desk, the same robe that had been tailored specifically for her when she was confirmed to the federal bench 5 years earlier. As she slipped it on, she felt the weight of everything it represented. Not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but the obligation to use it wisely. And today, it would serve as armor. Her clerk, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, knocked softly on the door. "Judge Patterson, the parties are assembled and we're ready to begin." "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be right out." Nova took one final look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked different, scarred, marked by violence, but not broken. If anything, she looked more formidable than before, because now she carried visible proof of the kind of injustice this courthouse was supposed to prevent. The case scheduled for that morning was Coleman Industries versus Marcus Thompson, a corporate discrimination lawsuit that had drawn significant attention from civil rights organizations. Marcus Thompson, a black executive, had been wrongfully terminated after reporting a pattern of racial harassment within the company. The defense was arguing that his termination was performance-based, but the evidence suggested otherwise. As Nova prepared to enter the courtroom, she thought about the irony. Here she was, about to preside over a case about racial discrimination, while bearing fresh wounds from discriminatory treatment within the very building where justice was supposed to be administered. But that irony would soon become a powerful tool for truth. Nova opened the chamber's door and walked the short corridor that led directly to the bench. The courtroom was packed, attorneys for both sides, a jury, media representatives, and observers from various civil rights organizations. It was exactly the kind of high-profile case that demanded her full attention and expertise. As she entered the courtroom, conversations stopped abruptly. The usual rustling of papers and whispered consultations fell silent as people processed what they were seeing. Some looked confused, others shocked, and a few appeared genuinely disturbed by her appearance. Nova climbed the steps to the bench with deliberate dignity, each movement calculated to project authority, despite the assault she had endured. She settled into her chair, arranged her papers, and looked out over the courtroom with the same composed expression she had worn for thousands of hearings. But this time was different. This time, every person in that room could see exactly what could happen to a black woman in America, even one with the highest levels of education, achievement, and legal protection. "All rise," called the bailiff. A different man from the security checkpoint, someone who had always treated Judge Patterson with appropriate respect. The entire courtroom stood. Nova noticed several people staring at her scalp, trying to process the disconnect between her obvious authority and the evidence of recent humiliation. Some looked away quickly, as if ashamed to witness her vulnerability. Others maintained steady eye contact, recognizing the strength it took for her to be there. "Be seated," Nova said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Court is now in session in the matter of Coleman Industries versus Marcus Thompson. She picked up her gavel, the weight familiar and comforting in her hand. But before she brought it down to officially open proceedings, she paused and looked toward the back of the courtroom. Standing near the gallery doors, looking increasingly uncomfortable, was Deputy Keith Beaumont. He had apparently come to observe the hearing, a common practice for courthouse security when high-profile cases were being heard. His presence was standard procedure. But when his eyes met Nova's across the crowded courtroom, his expression changed completely. The confident smirk he had worn 30 minutes earlier disappeared, replaced by something much closer to panic. Because Keith Beaumont was finally realizing that the woman he had assaulted wasn't just another black woman who didn't belong in the federal courthouse. She was the federal judge. And she was about to preside over a case about the exact kind of discrimination he had just committed against her. Nova brought her gavel down once, the sound echoing through the suddenly tense courtroom. And the reckoning began. "Before we proceed with opening statements," Nova said, her voice carrying the authority of years on the bench, "I want to address something that happened in this building approximately 30 minutes ago." The courtroom was dead silent. Attorneys leaned forward, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. In the back of the room, Keith Beaumont had gone completely still, his face pale as he began to understand the magnitude of his situation. "I was assaulted by courthouse security," Nova continued, her tone remaining judicial despite the explosive nature of her words. "Specifically, I was physically restrained and had my hair forcibly removed by Deputy Keith Beaumont in what he claimed was a random security screening." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Several reporters began typing frantically on their phones. The attorneys at both tables exchanged glances, unsure how to process what they were hearing. Nova gestured toward the back of the courtroom. "Deputy Beaumont is present in this courtroom right now, and I want the record to reflect that his actions constitute not only assault and battery, but a violation of judicial immunity and federal civil rights statutes." Keith began backing toward the exit, but Nova's voice stopped him. "Deputy Beaumont, please remain where you are. Bailiff, please ensure that Deputy Beaumont does not leave this courtroom." The bailiff, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation, moved to block Keith's exit. The deputy's hands were shaking now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Your Honor," interrupted the defense attorney, a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit, "perhaps this matter should be addressed separately from the case at hand." Nova's gaze shifted to him with laser focus. "Mr. Carson, are you suggesting that when a federal judge is assaulted in the very building where she works, it should be handled quietly, behind closed doors? That the business of justice should proceed as if discrimination and violence are simply inconveniences to be managed?" The attorney's face reddened. "No, Your Honor, I simply meant..." "You meant that we should ignore what just happened," Nova said, "because addressing it directly might be uncomfortable for the people who benefit from a system that allows such treatment." She turned her attention to the plaintiff's attorney, a black woman named Rebecca Washington. "Ms. Washington, your client is here because he reported racial harassment and was punished for it. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. And the defense's position is that his termination was based on performance issues, not retaliation for reporting discrimination." "That's correct, Your Honor." Nova nodded slowly. "Then this courtroom is about to see a real-time demonstration of exactly the kind of institutional racism your client experienced." She looked directly at Keith, who was now sweating despite the air conditioning. Deputy Beaumont stepped forward. Keith hesitated, looking around for support that wasn't coming. The other courthouse staff present were carefully avoiding eye contact, distancing themselves from his actions. "I said step forward," Nova repeated, her voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. Keith walked unsteadily to the center of the courtroom, his uniform wrinkled and his confidence completely shattered. "State your name for the record," Nova instructed. Keith Beaumont. "And your position?" "Deputy Security Officer, Denver Federal Courthouse." "How long have you held that position?" 12 years. Nova leaned forward slightly. "In those 12 years, Deputy Beaumont, How many times have you performed random security screenings that involved forcibly cutting off someone's hair? Keith's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I'll repeat the question. How many times have you used hair removal as a security measure? You looked suspicious. That's not what I asked. How many times have you cut off someone's hair as part of security screening? The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, Keith whispered, Never. So this was not standard procedure. This was not random. This was a specific decision you made about me personally. Is that correct? Keith looked desperately around the courtroom, but found no allies. You didn't look like... Like what, Deputy Beaumont? I didn't look like what? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Everyone in the courtroom knew what he meant, but making him say it would expose the ugly truth that everyone preferred to keep hidden. Like someone who belonged here, Keith finally admitted. Nova sat back in her chair, letting his words echo through the courtroom. And what, in your opinion, does someone who belongs in a federal courthouse look like? Keith realized he had walked into a trap, but there was no way out. Any answer he gave would only make his situation worse. The truth was already obvious to everyone present, and the reckoning was just beginning. What they discovered next would destroy everything they believed about courthouse security. Your Honor, Keith stammered, his face now dripping with perspiration. I was just doing my job. I had no idea who you were. Nova's expression remained calm, but her voice carried a new edge. That's precisely the problem, Deputy Beaumont. You didn't care who I was. You saw a black woman and decided she needed to be degraded. She turned to address the courtroom. Let the record show that Deputy Beaumont has admitted to targeting me, specifically because I didn't look like I belonged in a federal courthouse. This is not speculation about discrimination. This is a confession. Rebecca Washington, the plaintiff's attorney, was staring in amazement. Her client's case had just received the most powerful evidence possible, a real-time demonstration of institutional racism by a courthouse employee, confessing his bias in front of a room full of witnesses. But Nova wasn't finished. She pressed a button on her desk and her clerk's voice came through the intercom. Yes, Your Honor. Sarah, please contact the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. I want federal prosecutors here within the hour to file charges against Deputy Beaumont for assault, civil rights violations, and interference with federal judicial duties. Yes, Your Honor. Nova then looked toward the court reporter. I also want a complete transcript of this morning's proceedings, rushed to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and I want Deputy Beaumont's personnel file subpoenaed immediately. Keith's legs were shaking now. What had started as a routine morning of asserting dominance over someone he considered beneath him had transformed into a federal case that would likely destroy his career and send him to prison. Furthermore, Nova continued, I want a full investigation into every complaint ever filed against Deputy Beaumont, and I want to know who in the courthouse administration was responsible for reviewing and responding to those complaints. She turned to Keith one more time. Deputy Beaumont, how many complaints have been filed against you for discriminatory behavior? I don't know exactly. You don't know? Or you don't want to tell this courtroom? Keith's supervisor, Chief Deputy Raymond Palmer, had entered the courtroom and was standing near the back, his face grim. Nova spotted him immediately. Chief Palmer, please step forward. Palmer walked to the front of the courtroom, his posture rigid with military precision. Unlike Keith, he understood the gravity of the situation and the impossible position he was now in. Chief Palmer, you supervise Deputy Beaumont, correct? Yes, Your Honor. How many formal complaints have been filed against him? Palmer hesitated, then answered truthfully. 8 formal complaints over the past 5 years, Your Honor. A gasp went through the courtroom. 8 complaints meant this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern that had been documented and apparently ignored. 8 complaints, Nova repeated. And what action was taken on those complaints? They were reviewed and deemed unsubstantiated. All 8 of them? Yes, Your Honor. Nova leaned back in her chair, processing this information. Chief Palmer, were any of the complainants black women? Palmer's silence was answer enough. I'll ask again. Were any of the 8 people who complained about Deputy Beaumont's behavior black women? 7 of them were, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. The pattern was now undeniable. Keith Beaumont had been targeting black women specifically, and the courthouse administration had been covering it up by dismissing every complaint as unsubstantiated. And who made the determination that these complaints were unsubstantiated? Palmer looked like he wanted to disappear. The complaints were reviewed by Chief Administrative Judge William Reynolds. Nova wrote down the name carefully. Judge Reynolds dismissed all 8 complaints without investigation. The investigations were limited in scope. Meaning what exactly? Meaning we interviewed Deputy Beaumont, who denied any wrongdoing, and we accepted his version of events. The absurdity of the system was now laid bare. 8 black women had complained about discriminatory treatment by the same deputy, and instead of investigating their claims seriously, the courthouse administration had simply asked the accused if he was guilty and accepted his denial. Nova looked out over the courtroom, which was now buzzing with shocked conversations. Reporters were typing frantically, civil rights advocates were taking notes, and the attorneys involved in the original case were realizing they were witnessing something historic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nova said, her voice rising above the murmur, "what you are witnessing is not an isolated incident. What happened to me this morning is what happens to countless people who don't have the protection of judicial immunity. The only difference is that when it happened to me, you all got to watch." She paused, letting that sink in. "And now you're going to watch what justice looks like when it's applied equally." But what the courtroom didn't know was that this was only the beginning, because hidden in Judge Reynolds' office was evidence of a cover-up that went far deeper than anyone imagined. "Bailiff," Nova commanded, "I want Deputy Beaumont placed in custody immediately. Charges to include assault, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and interference with federal judicial proceedings." The bailiff, clearly uncomfortable, but recognizing the authority of the order, approached Keith with handcuffs. "Sir, please place your hands behind your back." Keith looked around desperately for support, but found none. Chief Palmer had stepped back, effectively abandoning him. The other courthouse staff present were avoiding eye contact. His colleagues in security had disappeared entirely. "Your Honor," Keith pleaded, "I was just following protocol. I didn't mean any harm." Nova's response was swift and precise. "Deputy Beaumont, you admitted under oath that you targeted me because I didn't look like I belonged. That's not protocol, that's discrimination, and the harm was very much intentional." As Keith was led away in handcuffs, Nova turned her attention back to Chief Palmer. "Chief Palmer, I want you to personally retrieve every complaint file related to Deputy Beaumont from the administrative offices. I want them in this courtroom within 30 minutes. Your Honor, some of those files may be confidential." "Chief Palmer," Nova interrupted, "confidentiality protections exist to shield victims, not to protect institutions from accountability. You will retrieve those files, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Palmer nodded quickly and left to comply with the order. Nova then addressed the attorneys at both tables. "Ms. Washington, Mr. Carson, we're going to take a 30-minute recess while these files are retrieved, but I want both of you to understand that what just happened is directly relevant to the case before us." She looked specifically at the defense attorney. "Mr. Carson, your client Coleman Industries has argued that discrimination claims are often exaggerated or fabricated. You've maintained that Mr. Thompson's termination was based on legitimate performance issues, not retaliation for reporting harassment." Carson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But this courtroom has just witnessed documented, admitted discrimination by a federal employee, enabled by a system that routinely dismissed complaints from black women. So when your client claims that Mr. Thompson's experiences were somehow invalid or exaggerated, you'll need to explain how that differs from the pattern we've just exposed." Rebecca Washington was struggling to contain her amazement. In 30 minutes, her case had been transformed from a standard employment discrimination lawsuit into a federal civil rights matter with live witnesses and real-time confessions. During the recess, word of what was happening in courtroom 7A spread throughout the Denver federal courthouse like wildfire. Staff members whispered in hallways about the judge who had been assaulted, and was now dispensing justice from the bench. Some were horrified by Keith's actions. Others were nervous about what other practices might be exposed. Chief Administrative Judge William Reynolds was in his office, frantically making phone calls. As the judge who had dismissed the 8 complaints against Keith, he knew his own career was now in jeopardy. The files Chief Palmer was retrieving would show not just a pattern of discrimination, but a pattern of cover-ups that reached the highest levels of courthouse administration. When Palmer returned with a box of files, Nova instructed him to place them on the court clerk's desk. "Sarah, I want you to read aloud the summary of each complaint filed against Deputy Beaumont, along with the administrative response." The first file detailed a complaint from Dr. Angela Morris, a black pediatrician who had been forced to undergo an invasive search after testifying as an expert witness. Keith had claimed she looked suspicious and subjected her to questioning about how she could afford her professional attire. Administrative response: complaint unsubstantiated. Deputy Beaumont followed appropriate security protocols. The second complaint came from Professor Janet Williams, a black law professor, who had been detained and questioned about whether she was really a lawyer after presenting her bar credentials. Administrative response: complaint unsubstantiated. No evidence of discriminatory intent. As Sarah continued reading, a clear pattern emerged. Every complainant was a black woman. Every incident involved Keith questioning their right to be in the courthouse. And every complaint had been dismissed by Judge Reynolds without meaningful investigation. By the 5th complaint, several people in the gallery were shaking their heads in disgust. By the 8th, even Mr. Carson looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor," Rebecca Washington said, "I'd like to request that Dr. Morris and Professor Williams be contacted immediately. I believe they would want to know that their complaints are finally being taken seriously." Nova nodded. "Granted. Sarah, please contact all 8 complainants and inform them that their cases are being reopened as part of a federal investigation." She then looked toward the gallery, where several reporters were live-streaming the proceedings. "I also want the public to understand that what happened here today represents a failure of institutional oversight that enabled discrimination to flourish unchecked." But Nova wasn't finished. Because if you want to know how true change happens, it's when someone gets the chance to ask, "If this is how a federal judge is treated in this building, how do you think ordinary citizens are treated?" These stories of courage inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from, so we can see how far these powerful messages are reaching. While Sarah was making phone calls to the 8 women who had filed complaints against Keith, Nova made a decision that would transform the proceedings from a single case into a comprehensive examination of institutional discrimination. "Bailiff, I want you to contact Dr. Angela Morris immediately. If she's available, I want her in this courtroom within the hour." Nova then turned to the packed gallery. "For those observing these proceedings, I want you to understand what you're witnessing. This is what happens when discrimination is documented, reported, and then systematically ignored by the people charged with preventing it." She gestured toward the box of complaint files. 8 women, all professionals, all credentialed, all black, reported discriminatory treatment by the same courthouse employee, and all 8 were told their experiences didn't matter. As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, the courtroom doors opened and Dr. Angela Morris entered. A distinguished woman in her 40s, she wore a navy blue suit and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. But when she saw Nova's shorn scalp, her expression shifted to one of recognition and solidarity. "Dr. Morris," Nova said, "thank you for coming so quickly. I believe you're familiar with Deputy Keith Beaumont." "Unfortunately, yes, Your Honor. Would you please tell this courtroom what happened during your encounter with him?" Dr. Morris approached the witness stand, was sworn in, and began her testimony. "I was here 18 months ago to provide expert testimony in a child custody case. I had testified in federal court numerous times before, always without incident." She paused, gathering herself. "Deputy Beaumont stopped me at security and claimed I looked suspicious. He questioned how I could afford my clothing, asked if I was really a doctor, and demanded additional credentials beyond what's normally required." "Did he subject white physicians to the same treatment?" "No, Your Honor. Dr. Richard Steinberg, a white colleague, passed through security immediately before me with no additional screening whatsoever. Nova nodded. And when you filed a complaint about this treatment, I was told that Deputy Beaumont had followed proper protocols and that my complaint was unsubstantiated. Dr. Morris's voice carried years of frustration. I was essentially told that my professional judgment about discriminatory treatment was less credible than his word. Dr. Morris, what impact did this experience have on your willingness to participate in federal court proceedings? I stopped accepting requests to testify as an expert witness. I couldn't risk being humiliated again, and I didn't trust that the courthouse would protect me from discrimination. The implications were staggering. A qualified medical professional had been driven away from participating in the justice system because of one deputy's discriminatory behavior and the administration's failure to address it. Nova looked toward the gallery, where more people had gathered as word spread about the extraordinary proceedings. Dr. Morris, had you ever been treated this way in other professional contexts? Never, Your Honor. Not in hospitals, not in medical conferences, not in any other courthouse. This was unique to this building and this particular deputy. As Dr. Morris stepped down, Nova turned her attention to Chief Palmer, who had returned and was standing uncomfortably near the back of the courtroom. Chief Palmer, Dr. Morris just testified that Deputy Beaumont's behavior was discriminatory and that your investigation was inadequate. Do you have any response? Palmer looked like he was calculating how much truth he could afford to tell. Your Honor, we may not have investigated as thoroughly as we should have. May not have? Chief Palmer, according to the file, your entire investigation consisted of asking Deputy Beaumont if he had discriminated against Dr. Morris. When he said no, you closed the case. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you found that to be a sufficient investigation of a civil rights complaint? Palmer's silence was damning. Nova continued. Chief Palmer, I want you to explain to this courtroom how asking an accused person if they committed discrimination and accepting their denial as conclusive evidence constitutes a legitimate investigation. Guys, we trusted Deputy Beaumont's word. You trusted his word over that of 8 professional women, including a physician and a law professor. The absurdity of the system was now completely exposed. The courthouse administration had essentially operated on the assumption that complaints of discrimination were presumptively false unless the accused confessed. But Nova wasn't finished exposing the depth of the problem, because at that moment, her clerk Sarah approached the bench with a note that would reveal just how high this conspiracy of silence reached. Your Honor, Sarah whispered, Judge Reynolds is on the phone. He says it's urgent and relates to the complaints we're discussing. Nova's eyes narrowed. Judge William Reynolds, the man who had dismissed all 8 complaints against Keith, was apparently ready to talk. But Nova suspected his urgency had more to do with self-preservation than justice. Tell Judge Reynolds that if he has information relevant to these proceedings, he can provide it in person, in this courtroom, under oath. Sarah nodded and returned to her desk to relay the message. Nova then addressed the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to discover just how deep this institutional failure goes. Because the evidence suggests that Deputy Beaumont's behavior wasn't just tolerated, it was protected by people who should have known better. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as everyone realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a federal judge conducting a real-time investigation of corruption within her own courthouse. 10 minutes later, Judge William Reynolds entered courtroom 7A, and his appearance told the entire story. At 63, Reynolds was a 20-year veteran of the federal bench, known for his conservative approach to civil rights cases and his reluctance to find discrimination even when evidence was overwhelming. But today he looked like a man who knew his career was about to end. Judge Reynolds, Nova said formally, thank you for joining us. I understand you have information relevant to the complaint files we've been reviewing. Reynolds approached the witness stand reluctantly. As a sitting federal judge, he rarely found himself in the position of being questioned under oath, and his discomfort was obvious to everyone present. Judge Reynolds, you reviewed and dismissed 8 complaints against Deputy Beaumont over a 5-year period. Is that correct? Yes. And in each case, you determined that the complaints were unsubstantiated. Reynolds hesitated. Yes, but just yes or no, please. You found all 8 complaints unsubstantiated. Yes. Nova picked up one of the complaint files. Dr. Angela Morris, who just testified, provided detailed documentation of her encounter with Deputy Beaumont, including witness statements from other courthouse visitors. Did you review that documentation? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. I reviewed the file. That's not what I asked. Did you review Dr. Morris's supporting documentation, including witness statements? A long pause. No. You dismissed her complaint without reviewing the evidence she provided. The initial review suggested, Judge Reynolds, yes or no, did you review Dr. Morris's supporting evidence before dismissing her complaint? No. The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. Nova continued methodically through each of the 8 complaints, extracting the same admission. Reynolds had dismissed every single one without reviewing the supporting evidence. Judge Reynolds, why didn't you review the evidence these women provided? For the first time, Reynolds looked directly at Nova, and she could see something that looked like shame in his eyes. Because I believed that Deputy Beaumont was maintaining appropriate courthouse security. Even when 8 different women, all professionals, all credible, reported discriminatory treatment, I thought. Reynolds paused, realizing that any answer would be incriminating. I thought they might be oversensitive to normal security procedures. The courtroom reacted with audible gasps and murmurs. Reynolds had just admitted that he considered 8 separate civil rights complaints to be products of oversensitivity rather than legitimate concerns about discrimination. Judge Reynolds, are you familiar with the legal standard for civil rights violations under federal law? Of course. And you understand that dismissing complaints without investigation can constitute a violation of due process? Reynolds was silent. I'll ask again. Do you understand that your failure to investigate these complaints may itself be a violation of federal law? Yes. Nova leaned forward. Judge Reynolds, I want you to explain to this courtroom how a federal judge can dismiss 8 civil rights complaints without reviewing evidence and still claim to be upholding the law. Reynolds looked around the courtroom desperately, but found no allies. The reporters were documenting every word. The civil rights advocates were taking notes, and his judicial colleagues, who might normally support him, were conspicuously absent. Your Honor, my review process may have been insufficient. Insufficient? Nova's voice rose slightly. Judge Reynolds, you violated the constitutional rights of 8 women and enabled continued discrimination by a courthouse employee. Is that what you call insufficient? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Reynolds had been forced to admit not just negligence, but willful blindness to civil rights violations. But Nova had one more revelation that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Judge Reynolds, did anyone else in courthouse administration know about your practice of dismissing complaints without investigation? Reynolds went pale. I'm not sure what you mean. Did you discuss your approach to civil rights complaints with other administrators? Did anyone else know you were ignoring evidence and dismissing cases without proper review? The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally, Reynolds whispered, There were discussions about managing complaints efficiently. Managing complaints efficiently, Nova repeated. And who was involved in these discussions? Reynolds looked like he wanted to disappear. Chief Administrative Officer Patricia Manning and Courthouse Director James Walsh. 2 more names added to the growing list of officials who had participated in the cover-up. Nova wrote them down carefully, knowing that each name represented another career that would soon be over. Judge Reynolds, step down. As Reynolds left the witness stand, Nova addressed the packed courtroom. What we've discovered here isn't just discrimination by one deputy. It's a systematic effort by courthouse leadership to suppress civil rights complaints and protect discriminatory behavior. She paused, letting that sink in. And we're not done yet. The truth that emerged would change everything forever. As Judge Reynolds exited the courtroom in disgrace, Nova's clerk Sarah approached the bench with another urgent message. Your Honor, we have Chief Administrative Officer Patricia Manning on the line. She says she needs to speak with you immediately about limiting the damage from today's proceedings. Nova's expression hardened. Tell Ms. Manning that if she wants to limit damage, she can start by appearing in this courtroom to answer questions under oath. The phrase limiting the damage revealed everything Nova needed to know about the administration's mindset. They weren't concerned about justice or accountability. They were worried about protecting themselves and the institution's reputation. Within minutes, Patricia Manning entered the courtroom, accompanied by a private attorney. At 55, Manning had been the chief administrative officer for 8 years, responsible for overseeing all non-judicial personnel and handling employee complaints. Her presence with legal counsel signaled that she understood the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Manning," Nova began, "you've been present in this building while we've exposed a pattern of discrimination and cover-up. Do you have anything to say about your role in these events?" Manning's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, my client invokes her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." The invocation of the Fifth Amendment in open court sent a shockwave through the gallery. Manning wasn't just declining to answer questions. She was admitting that her truthful answers might incriminate her in criminal activity. "Ms. Manning," Nova continued, "are you claiming that answering questions about your administrative duties might tend to incriminate you?" Manning's attorney answered for her. "That's correct, Your Honor." Nova nodded slowly. "Then let me ask you this, Counselor. Is your client claiming Fifth Amendment protection for her entire tenure as Chief Administrative Officer, or just for specific actions related to civil rights complaints?" The attorney hesitated. "Your Honor, without knowing the scope of potential charges, we must invoke broad protection." "So, Ms. Manning is claiming that virtually everything she did as Chief Administrative Officer might be criminal." The admission was devastating. Manning had essentially confessed that her administration of courthouse personnel policies was so corrupt that discussing it might lead to criminal charges. But Nova had one more card to play. During the recess, Sarah had been quietly contacting the other women who had filed complaints against Keith, and one of them had just arrived. "Your Honor," Sarah announced, "Professor Janet Williams is here and requests permission to address the court." Professor Williams entered with the bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding law school classrooms. At 60, she was a respected constitutional law scholar who had argued cases before the Supreme Court. Her presence added another layer of credibility to the proceedings. "Professor Williams," Nova said, "you filed a complaint against Deputy Beaumont 2 years ago. Would you tell this courtroom what happened?" Professor Williams took the witness stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to legal proceedings. "I was here to observe oral arguments in a case I was monitoring for a law review article. Deputy Beaumont stopped me at security and questioned whether I was really a lawyer. When I showed him my bar credentials, he said they looked fake and demanded additional identification. How did you respond?" "I provided my law school faculty ID, my Supreme Court bar card, and my driver's license. He examined them for nearly 15 minutes, while other people, all white, passed through security without any additional screening." "And when you filed a complaint?" "I was told by Judge Reynolds that Deputy Beaumont had followed appropriate protocols and that my complaint was unsubstantiated. I was also told that if I continued to make trouble, I might find myself unwelcome in this courthouse. The threat was explicit: comply with discrimination or face retaliation." Professor Williams had been told to accept degrading treatment or risk being banned from the courthouse entirely. "Professor Williams, how did this experience affect your view of the federal court system?" "I stopped bringing my law students here for educational visits. I couldn't risk exposing them to the same discriminatory treatment, and I couldn't in good conscience tell them that this courthouse represented equal justice under law." The implications were staggering. Say a law professor, someone responsible for training the next generation of attorneys, had been so traumatized by discrimination that she stopped using the courthouse for educational purposes. Nova looked out over the courtroom, which was now packed beyond capacity. Word had spread throughout Denver's legal community, and attorneys, law students, and civil rights advocates had gathered to witness the unprecedented proceedings. "Ladies and gentlemen," Nova said, "we've now heard from multiple victims of discrimination, documented a pattern of cover-up by courthouse leadership, and seen administrative officers invoke the Fifth Amendment rather than answer questions about their conduct. She paused, letting the full scope of the corruption sink in. But this is where the real work begins, because exposing the problem is only the first step. Now we have to fix it. And that's when Nova Patterson did something that would change federal courthouse policy across the entire country. "Bailiff," Nova commanded, "I want you to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office and request that federal prosecutors be assigned to investigate civil rights violations by courthouse personnel. I also want the FBI's Civil Rights Division notified immediately." The transformation of the morning's events from a single assault to a federal investigation was now complete. What had started with Keith shaving Nova's hair had exposed a web of discrimination and corruption that reached the highest levels of courthouse administration. But Nova wasn't finished. She had decided to use her position and the national attention now focused on Courtroom 7A to create lasting change. "I am also announcing the immediate creation of the Patterson Protocol," Nova said, her voice carrying the authority of years on the bench. "This protocol will establish new standards for accountability and civil rights protection in federal courthouses." She turned to her clerk. "Sarah, I want you to take down these requirements as I state them. They will be forwarded to the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts as formal policy recommendations." The courtroom fell silent as Nova began outlining a comprehensive reform program that would transform how federal courthouses operated. First, all courthouse security personnel will undergo mandatory civil rights training every 6 months, with testing requirements and termination for failure to meet standards. Second, every civil rights complaint filed against courthouse personnel will be investigated by an independent review board that includes community representatives, not just courthouse administrators. Third, any courthouse employee who receives more than 2 substantiated civil rights complaints will be immediately terminated and banned from federal employment. Fourth, all security screenings must be recorded, with footage retained for 1 year and made available to complainants upon request. Fifth, federal courthouses will establish citizen oversight committees with the authority to review employee conduct and recommend disciplinary action. As Nova continued outlining the Patterson Protocol, she could see the impact of her words rippling through the courtroom. Reporters were live-streaming every detail, civil rights advocates were taking notes, and courthouse personnel present looked increasingly uncomfortable. But the most significant moment came when Nova addressed the discrimination case that had originally brought everyone to the courtroom. "Ms. Washington, Mr. Carson," she said, turning to the attorneys, "I believe this morning's events have provided some clarity for your case." Rebecca Washington stood. "Your Honor, in light of what we've witnessed today, Coleman Industries' defense that discrimination claims are typically exaggerated seems problematic." Defense attorney Carson looked like he wanted to object, but he had no legal ground to stand on. His client's entire defense strategy had been undermined by the real-time demonstration of how discrimination operates and how institutions protect perpetrators. "Mr. Carson," Nova said, "does your client still maintain that Mr. Thompson's experiences of discrimination were exaggerated or fabricated?" Carson consulted with his client. A whispered conversation that everyone in the courtroom could see was desperate damage control. Finally, he stood. "Your Honor, in light of today's testimony, Coleman Industries would like to request a settlement conference." The admission was tantamount to surrender. Carson's client had realized that arguing against the reality of discrimination in a courtroom, where discrimination had just been exposed and confessed, would be legal suicide. "Mr. Thompson," Nova said, addressing the plaintiff directly, "you've been present for these proceedings. How do you feel about what you've witnessed today?" Marcus Thompson, a dignified man in his 40s who had been wrongfully terminated for reporting harassment, stood slowly. "Your Honor, I feel vindicated. For 2 years I've been told that what happened to me wasn't really discrimination, that I was being oversensitive, that I misunderstood normal workplace dynamics." His voice grew stronger. "But what happened to you this morning, and what we've learned about how this courthouse has operated, proves that discrimination is real, that it's systematic, and that institutions will protect perpetrators if we let them." Nova nodded. "Mr. Thompson, your case helped expose something much larger than workplace discrimination. It helped expose how discrimination is enabled and protected by people who should know better. She turned back to the attorneys. I'm granting Ms. Washington's request for a settlement conference, but I want it completed within 48 hours. Mr. Carson, your client has an opportunity to demonstrate that they've learned something from today's proceedings. As the original case moved toward resolution, Nova prepared to address the broader implications of what had occurred. Because what happened next would determine whether this day marked a temporary embarrassment for one courthouse or the beginning of systemic change across the federal court system. The real test was about to begin. As word of the Patterson Protocol spread beyond Courtroom 7A, Nova received a message that elevated the day's events to national significance. Your Honor, Sarah announced, you have a call from Congressman Michael Rodriguez, chairman of the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights. He's requesting an immediate briefing on today's proceedings. Nova knew that congressional attention meant the Patterson Protocol could become federal law rather than just courthouse policy. But it also meant political scrutiny that could potentially undermine the reforms she was trying to implement. Tell Congressman Rodriguez that I'll provide a full briefing, but only after these proceedings are complete and the FBI investigation is underway. The courtroom doors opened, and FBI Special Agent Maria Santos entered, accompanied by two other federal agents. Santos approached the bench with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling sensitive investigations. Your Honor, we've been briefed on the situation and are prepared to begin a comprehensive civil rights investigation. Nova nodded. Agent Santos, I want to ensure that this investigation covers not just the immediate assault, but the systematic suppression of civil rights complaints by courthouse administration. Understood, Your Honor. We'll need to interview all complainants, review personnel files, and examine the administrative processes that allowed this pattern to continue. As the FBI began their work, Nova turned her attention to the growing crowd in the courtroom gallery. What had started as a routine hearing had become a national moment, with civil rights leaders, legal scholars, and media representatives documenting every development. Ladies and gentlemen, Nova said, addressing the packed courtroom, I want you to understand what you've witnessed today. This isn't just about one deputy or one courthouse. This is about how discrimination operates when good people choose to look the other way. She gestured toward the complaint files that had been read aloud. 8 women, professionals, experts in their fields, pillars of their communities, reported discrimination and were told their experiences didn't matter. How many others never reported at all? How many simply accepted degrading treatment because they knew no one would listen? Professor Williams, who was still present, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to say something to the young people who might be watching this. Nova nodded. Please proceed, Professor. To the law students, to the young attorneys, to anyone who believes in justice, what happened here today shows that change is possible, but only when people in positions of authority choose to use their power responsibly. Professor Williams turned to face the gallery. Judge Patterson could have handled this quietly, through back channels to avoid embarrassment to the institution. Instead, she chose transparency and accountability. That's what leadership looks like. The comment resonated throughout the courtroom, and Nova felt the weight of what she had started. This was no longer just about seeking justice for herself. It had become about creating a model for how institutions should respond when discrimination is exposed. But the most significant development came when Sarah approached with another message. Your Honor, you're receiving calls from federal judges in 12 different circuits. They want to know how to implement the Patterson Protocol in their own courthouses. The demand for reform was spreading faster than Nova had expected. Judges across the country were recognizing that the problems exposed in Denver likely existed in their own buildings, and they wanted to address them proactively rather than wait for their own crisis. Sarah, set up a conference call with the circuit court administrators. I want the Patterson Protocol distributed to every federal courthouse in the country within 72 hours. As Nova worked to transform her individual experience into systemic change, Agent Santos returned with an update on the investigation. Your Honor, we've identified additional potential victims. Deputy Beaumont's discriminatory behavior appears to have affected dozens of courthouse visitors over the past decade. The scope of the harm was even larger than anyone had realized. Keith's actions hadn't been isolated incidents. They represented a sustained campaign of discrimination that had touched countless lives. Agent Santos, I want every victim contacted and offered the opportunity to file federal charges, and I want a comprehensive review of how this courthouse's complaint system failed so systematically. As the afternoon wore on, Nova realized that what had started as the worst morning of her career was becoming the most important day of her judicial service. The Patterson Protocol was being implemented. The FBI investigation was uncovering the full extent of the corruption, and federal judges nationwide were demanding similar reforms. But there was still one more thing Nova needed to do to complete the transformation of this day, from tragedy to triumph. And it would require her to be more personally vulnerable than she had ever been in public. As the formal proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Nova made a decision that would define her legacy. Instead of retreating to her chambers to process the day's events privately, she remained on the bench and addressed the people who had gathered to witness history. "Before we adjourn," Nova said, "I want to share something personal with all of you." The remaining audience, reporters, civil rights advocates, court staff, and community members, settled back into their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. This morning, when Deputy Beaumont forced me into that screening room and cut off my hair, he wasn't just committing assault. He was trying to strip away my dignity, my identity, my sense of belonging in this place where I've worked for 5 years. Nova reached up and touched her shorn scalp, the gesture both vulnerable and defiant. He wanted to humiliate me into silence, to make me understand that no matter what I had achieved, no matter what position I held, I was still just another black woman who needed to be put in her place. The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented, a federal judge sharing her most personal trauma in service of a larger truth. But what Deputy Beaumont didn't understand, what people like him never understand, is that our dignity doesn't come from our hair or our clothes, or our ability to meet someone else's expectations of how we should look. Nova stood, her judicial robe flowing around her as she stepped to the front of the bench. Our dignity comes from our commitment to justice, our willingness to stand up for what's right, and our refusal to be silent when we witness wrongdoing. She looked out over the courtroom, making eye contact with as many people as possible. Today, we transformed my humiliation into accountability. We turned one man's hatred into a catalyst for change. And we proved that justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It's something we create when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal. The applause began slowly with Professor Williams, then Dr. Morris, then others standing and clapping. But Nova raised her hand for silence. "I'm not finished," she said with a slight smile, "because there's something else I want to say to anyone who might be watching this." She paused, gathering herself for her final message. "If you've experienced discrimination, if you've been told that your complaints don't matter, if you've been made to feel like you don't belong, I want you to know that your voice matters. Your experiences are valid. And there are people in positions of power who will listen and act." Nova reached into her robe and pulled out a business card. "I'm establishing a federal hotline for civil rights complaints in courthouses. Anyone who experiences discrimination in any federal building can call this number and know that their complaint will be investigated thoroughly and fairly." The announcement represented the final piece of the Patterson Protocol, a direct pathway for victims to report discrimination without going through the same administrative channels that had failed so many others. "Change doesn't happen because institutions suddenly decide to do better," Nova continued. "Change happens because people like Dr. Morris and Professor Williams and Mr. Thompson refuse to be silent. Change happens because ordinary citizens demand accountability from their government." As Nova prepared to conclude the most extraordinary day in the courthouse's history, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional satisfaction. She had transformed her own victimization into a force for systemic change. "Court is adjourned," she said, bringing her gavel down one final time. But as people began to file out, many stopped to approach the bench. Dr. Morris shook Nova's hand with tears in her eyes. Professor Williams hugged her. Marcus Thompson simply said, Thank you for showing us what courage looks like. 6 months later, the Patterson Protocol had been implemented in federal courthouses across all 50 states. Keith Beaumont was serving a 3-year federal prison sentence. Judge Reynolds had resigned in disgrace, and Chief Administrative Officer Patricia Manning was facing federal civil rights charges. But perhaps most importantly, over 200 federal courthouse employees had been terminated or sanctioned for discriminatory behavior, as the protocol's implementation revealed the true scope of the problem. Nova's hair had grown back, silver and strong. She wore it shorter now, a reminder of the day when she learned that justice sometimes requires you to expose your own wounds in service of healing a broken system. Thank you to everyone who typed equality, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.